Donald Trump moved through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, but his mind was elsewhere. He had attended hundreds of these events: fundraisers, charity dinners, high-profile gatherings, but something felt different tonight. As he stood near the refreshment table, sipping his Diet Coke, his attention was drawn to a quiet conversation at a nearby table. An elderly woman sat there, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, speaking in a soft yet firm voice to a small group of listeners. Something about her demeanor caught his attention. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, nor was she looking for sympathy. She was simply telling her story. "My husband was a firefighter," she said, her voice carrying a mix of pride and sorrow. 35 years of service. He saved more lives than I can count. But he came home one day, coughing so bad he couldn't breathe. The doctor said it was the smoke, the chemicals. Years of it building up in his lungs. He was gone within months. The table fell silent. The weight of her words settled over them, even as the laughter and music of the gala continued in the background. Trump felt something shift inside him. He had heard thousands of stories in his lifetime, but this one struck a different chord. Perhaps it was the way she spoke about her late husband, not as a victim, but as a hero. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity in her voice, the unwavering love she still carried for him. "I don't regret a single moment," she continued, her eyes glistening. "But times have been hard. I lost more than a husband. I lost my best friend, my home, my security. The pension barely covers the bills. Some nights I sit in the dark just to save on electricity." A gentleman at the table patted her hand, offering a comforting smile. "You are an inspiration, truly. The city should be taking better care of the families of our fallen heroes." She nodded, but there was no bitterness in her expression. "I get by," she said simply. "God provides." Trump had heard enough. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, pulling out the chair beside her. She looked up in surprise as he sat down, his expression unreadable. "I couldn't help but overhear," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Your husband sounds like an incredible man." The widow blinked, clearly caught off guard by his presence. "He was," she said, offering a small smile. Trump nodded thoughtfully. "And you," he said, glancing around the table. "You're stronger than most people I know." She chuckled, a touch of warmth in her eyes. "I just do what I have to." He was silent for a moment, then leaned in slightly. "Tell me something," he said. "What was his name?" She exhaled shakily, as if saying it aloud still carried weight. "James," she whispered. Trump sat back, nodding. "James," he repeated, as if committing it to memory. And then, without another word, he made a decision. The conversation lingered in Trump's mind long after he left the table. He had heard thousands of stories throughout his career, some tragic, some inspiring. But something about this widow's quiet strength struck a chord deep within him. It wasn't just about loss. It was about sacrifice. Her husband, James, had given everything to protect others, and now the woman who had stood by his side for decades was struggling just to keep the lights on. That didn't sit right with him. Trump wasn't one to act on impulse, but tonight was different. He turned to one of his closest aides and spoke in a firm, low voice. "Find out everything you can about her. Where she lives, what she needs, everything." The aide, used to Trump's directness, simply nodded and disappeared into the crowd. Trump, meanwhile, turned his attention back to the event, but his heart wasn't in it. He shook hands, exchanged pleasantries, and smiled for photos. But his mind kept drifting back to the widow's words. "Some nights I sit in the dark just to save on electricity." That didn't sit right with him either. An hour later, his aide returned, slipping a small notepad into Trump's hands. He glanced down, scanning the information quickly. Her name was Margaret Dawson. She lived alone in a modest house just outside the city, one she had almost lost after her husband's passing. The pension barely covered necessities, and she had been skipping meals to make ends meet. Trump exhaled slowly, tapping the notepad against his palm. He had made a career out of closing deals, building empires, and making tough decisions. But this wasn't about business. This was about doing the right thing. Later that night, as the event wrapped up and guests began making their way to the exits, Trump approached Margaret once more. She looked up at him, surprised, but still composed. "Margaret," he said, offering his hand, "would you mind taking a short drive with me?" She blinked. "A drive?" "Trust me," he said, a small smile forming. "It's worth it." Hesitating only briefly, she nodded. "All right." Within minutes, they were in the back of a sleek black SUV, the city lights flashing past as they drove in comfortable silence. Margaret occasionally glanced at Trump, curiosity in her eyes, but she didn't ask questions. Something about the way he carried himself told her that whatever this was, it mattered to him. When the car finally slowed to a stop, Margaret gasped. They were in front of her house. But something was different. The darkened windows, the quiet emptiness she had become accustomed to, none of it was the same. The entire property was glowing. Lights were on in every room. The porch, once creaky and worn, had been repaired. The yard, which she had struggled to maintain, had been cleaned and restored. And as she stepped out of the car, her breath caught in her throat. Her mortgage balance had been paid in full. She turned to Trump, her eyes wide with disbelief. What is this?" He simply smiled. "A thank you," he said, "for James and for you." Margaret stood frozen on the sidewalk, her hands trembling as she took in the sight before her. The home she had fought so hard to keep, the place where she and James had built a lifetime together, had been transformed overnight. The sagging porch was sturdy again, the flickering streetlight replaced with a bright glow, and the warmth of the house, once cold and dim, radiated through every window. Tears welled in her eyes, but she struggled to find the right words. I don't understand." Trump placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "There's nothing to understand, Margaret. You and James gave everything to this country. He saved lives. And you kept a home standing even when the world tried to take it from you. The least I can do is make sure you never have to worry about it again." She looked at him, disbelief etched across her features. "You did all this?" He nodded. "Your mortgage? Gone. Your bills? Covered. And I made a few calls. Some good friends of mine are making sure you'll never have to skip a meal or sit in the dark again." Margaret's breath hitched. She'd spent years learning to go without, accepting struggle as a part of life. The thought of never having to worry about it again was almost too much to bear. Tears slipped down her cheeks. James would have never believed this," she whispered. "He always said people forget about men like him once they're gone." Trump shook his head. "Not on my watch." His voice was firm, but filled with something deeper, genuine emotion. "James mattered. You matter, and I want you to know that." She let out a soft, shaky laugh, wiping at her eyes. "You're a good man, Mr. Trump," he grinned. "Don't let that get around. I've got a reputation to protect." Margaret laughed, and for the first time in a long time it wasn't forced or hollow. It was real. It was full. A small crowd had gathered. Neighbors peeking from porches, drawn by the commotion. Some of them had seen Margaret struggle, but few had truly understood the depths of it. Now they watched in awe as the man who had built skyscrapers and shaped economies had stopped everything just to take care of a widow who thought she had been forgotten. Trump turned to her one last time, his voice softer now. "You don't owe me anything, Margaret. Just live, be happy, and if you ever need anything—" He reached into his coat pocket and pressed a small card into her palm. "Call me." She clutched it like a lifeline, her heart pounding. As he walked back toward the car, she called out to him, her voice thick with emotion. James would have loved you." Trump paused, turning back with a small nod. "I think I would have loved him too." And with that he was gone. But Margaret knew in her heart that her life would never be the same again. The night passed in a blur for Margaret. She had spent so long worrying, counting pennies, and wondering how much longer she could hold on. And now, just like that, her burdens had been lifted. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the documents Trump's team had left with her. The mortgage was truly paid in full. A generous stipend had been arranged to cover her bills and daily expenses. Even her medical needs had been accounted for. It was overwhelming. She ran her fingers over the worn, wooden surface of the table, the same one she and James had sat at every morning, sipping coffee and talking about everything and nothing. She could almost hear his voice, his deep chuckle filling the room. "Looks like you finally caught a break, sweetheart." A fresh wave of tears filled her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of grief. They were of gratitude. The next morning, Margaret awoke to the sound of knocking on her door. She opened it hesitantly, only to find her neighbors gathered outside, their faces full of warmth and curiosity. "Margaret," Mrs. Thompson from across the street said, her voice thick with emotion. "Is it true? Did he really do all this for you?" Margaret nodded slowly. "He did." A murmur spread through the small crowd, a mix of shock and admiration. A younger woman, Sarah, stepped forward. "You deserve this. After everything you and James gave to this community, it's about time someone gave back." Margaret smiled, touched by the kindness. For years, she had felt invisible, her struggles hidden behind closed doors. Now, she realized she had never been as alone as she thought. That afternoon, she received a phone call from an unknown number. Hesitantly, she answered. "Margaret, it's Donald." She nearly dropped the phone. "Mr. Trump?" "Just checking in," he said casually. "Wanted to make sure you weren't overwhelmed." Margaret let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "I don't even have words for what you've done." "Well, don't go making a big fuss about it," he teased. "Just promise me something. Anything. Take care of yourself. And if you ever need anything, you pick up the phone and call me." Margaret swallowed hard, her chest tightening with emotion. "I will." There was a brief pause, then Trump's voice softened. "And one more thing." "Yes?" "You tell everyone about James. Keep his memory alive. People like him deserve to be remembered." Tears slipped down Margaret's cheeks as she smiled. "I promise." As she hung up the phone, she placed a hand over her heart, feeling the warmth spread through her. James was gone, but his legacy would never fade, and neither would the kindness of the man who had made sure of it. In the days that followed, Margaret's life changed in ways she never could have imagined. The quiet struggle she had endured for years had been replaced by a newfound sense of security, and something even more precious, purpose. She spent her morning sitting on her newly restored porch, greeting neighbors who passed by. People stopped more often now, not just to check in but to listen. Word had spread about what had happened, and with it, stories of James began to surface. Firefighters who had served alongside him stopped by to share memories. Families he had rescued came forward with gratitude. The man she had loved, the man she feared had been forgotten, was now a name people spoke with reverence. One afternoon, a young firefighter knocked on her door, his uniform crisp, his expression solemn. "Mrs. Dawson?" he asked. "Yes." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote this after hearing about your husband. I never met him, but I wanted you to know that his story inspired me. I'm only in my second year on the job, but men like him, they make me want to be better." Margaret unfolded the note with trembling hands and read the heartfelt words inside. Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, tipping his hat before walking away. Later that evening, Margaret sat down with a notebook, determined to fulfill the promise she had made to Trump. She wrote about James, not just the hero the world knew, but the man who had loved Sunday morning pancakes, who had danced with her in the kitchen when no one was watching, who had always made her laugh when she wanted to cry. She wrote, knowing that his legacy would live on in the words she put to paper. And then, one morning, as she was sipping her coffee on the porch, her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but when she answered, the familiar voice on the other end made her smile. "Margaret," Trump said warmly. "How's my favorite widow doing?" She laughed softly. "I'm doing just fine, Mr. Trump. I like the sound of that," he said. "Listen, I was thinking, what do you say we set up a fund in James's name? Something to help the families of fallen firefighters. Make sure no one else has to go through what you did." Margaret pressed a hand to her heart. "I think James would love that." "Then it's done," Trump said matter-of-factly. "And Margaret?" "Yes? You ever need anything, you know who to call." She smiled, her heart full. "I won't forget." As she ended the call, she looked up at the sky, feeling a deep sense of peace. James was still with her, and thanks to an act of kindness she never could have expected, his memory would live on forever.